If you've been researching your child's rights, you're probably coming across a term called FAPE, F-A-P-E, a whole lot, and you're probably wondering what it is. So we're here to tell you. FAPE is a free and appropriate public education, and it is the cornerstone of the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. FAPE is what each child who's identified for special education services is entitled to every school year.
Let's break down FAPE into all of the letters and what all of those words stand for. So let's start with free. What does that mean?
Free means at no cost, okay?
Right.
That's the language of the statute. Free means that parents of children who have special education needs should not have to be paying for their child to receive the public education to which they're entitled, just as their counterparts are not. So the whole idea being that the IDEA is really a civil rights law, and why should parents of children who have disabilities be paying for their kids to have an education when parents of children who do not have disabilities don't have to pay for a public education?
You know what I always say to people is imagine two kids getting on a school bus who live across the street from each other. One child is a typically developing child who's in regular education, and the other child is a child who has a disability who is receiving an individualized education plan under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The child who's in regular education, who does not have a disability, their parents do not pay for them to receive their public education. So in fact, if the child who lives across the street has to pay for their education, they're actually being discriminated against. They're being held to a different standard, which is why it's so important to remember that your child's special education should, in theory, be of no cost to you.
That's right. And so that's why there's the free and appropriate public education.
Now let's get to appropriate, because that's that's
Appropriate's
really
much more nebulous than free,
Yes.
okay? And the reason it is that what's appropriate to me may not be what's appropriate to you. You may think something's appropriate and the school district may not think it's appropriate. So with a word like appropriate, how does anyone know whether or not their child is receiving the program that they're legally entitled to? The word has been interpreted by many courts over many years, and it varies somewhat depending on where you live because of our system of government. So if you live in one circuit, they may have slightly different language. But the bottom line is that when the IDEA was passed, the whole idea was really just to get kids with disabilities access to our public schools. That was 1975.
And
thankfully, we've moved beyond that. And we've moved to the place where we want children to get meaningful educational benefit from their program. And so the standard is higher, and I would argue the standard is getting higher and higher every time the IDEA is reauthorized by Congress. So whether a program is appropriate depends on the individual child's needs. The unique needs of each child are going to be different, and one would hope that the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, would reflect that. And so when a IEP team or unfortunately, as when I get involved, a hearing officer or a court are trying to determine whether or not that document, that program actually gives the child the appropriate program, they're going to look at a lot of factors. They're going to look at the child's potential. They're going to look at whether or not this particular child needs more in this area of academic support, whereas another child might need more functional skills. So it just depends on the kid.
Well, and what makes it appropriate, there's so many factors involved in that, and it's a word that's open for interpretation, and
that's where I come in very often,
right. So public versus a private school that you might go and pay for privately because you've decided to opt out of the public education system. But what else can you say about the word public?
So this is where it gets tricky again, because just as we talked about free, it should be at no cost to parents. Public does not always mean public when you get into special education law and you analyze the cases. And the reason I say that is there are a number of cases where a parent doesn't agree with the public school program offered by their school district, and they have made something called a unilateral placement where they place their child in a private school program and then they exercise their rights under the IDEA to have the public funds pay for the private school. Now, that is not the norm. I mean, I would say that that's where a parent has tried very hard to keep their child usually in the public school, and it's not working. But in general, special education services are provided and are supposed to be provided in the public schools. It doesn't always happen that way, but that's the preference.
Right. And education.
So you and I say this every single day of our lives. Education is more than just academics.
Oh, boy.
This is so important to understand because so often when I'm representing a parent, the dispute is about the school district not wanting to recognize issues that perhaps the average person doesn't see as education. And that includes a lot of my parent clients who they don't understand that what they're looking for is actually part of education. So the school district may be saying, well, your child is on grade level in reading and math and their education is just fine, but if the child can't interact with their peers or have any daily living skills that allows them to be a functional member of society, that too is education. And the IDEA is quite clear about this, that education includes adaptive and functional skills. And I unfortunately, despite the fact that that's in the law, I still have to remind school districts of it almost every day.
Well, and what we hear all the time, and perhaps you have too, that your child may be too smart to qualify for special education. And in fact, that's one of those things that just completely gets under my skin. And that I often have to remind teams of, that education is far more than academics. It's social skills, it's behavior, it's communication, it's emotional, it's perhaps physical therapy, speech and language services, occupational therapy services. So it's not just what kind of grades your child is getting. And that's just so important to know.
And in fact, I'm often brought into those disputes because kids who are very intelligent, they sometimes are the last kids to be identified because they slip through the cracks, because they're not obviously suffering in the classroom. They may not be learning, but they're not obviously suffering in some way that triggers all of the adults to realize it. A lot of my clients have emotional disabilities, and so school districts will say, well, look at this kid, when she's here, she gets straight A's, she's very smart. And I say, yeah, but she's been here 9 days this school year. That's adversely impacting the education. So.
Right.